With us today, Andrew Alaniz from BBVA. He's responsible for a number of the cloud-specific areas at the bank, including cloud governance, security architecture, and cloud security operations. His team closely collaborates with DevOps, security operations, and IT engineering groups for their utilization of hybrid and public cloud environments. Side note, this actually, the genesis of this conversation and the idea of this panel was something that Andrew came to us with a number of months ago, sort of in our infancy. So I thank him very much for the idea and the boost getting this idea off the ground. I think it's a terrific format that I hope everyone will enjoy. Ivana Cojbasic from Regions currently serves as SVP of Information and Enterprise Architecture with Regions Bank, along with driving their Cloud Center of Excellence. Her experience in IT and information security spans more than 15 years, with a previous tenure at FIS as Deputy CISO. In that capacity, she led an array of vital security-minded groups, including identity access management, encryption and key management, application security, penetration testing, and vulnerability management. Also ISO 27001 certification. So we thank her for joining today. Also going to be a lot of great insight given what Regions is doing lately. Willie Clemons from EBSCO, Director of Identity and Access Management, spanning over 28 years working primarily in infrastructure and InfoSec, including with employment with a number of notable Birmingham organizations such as Regions, BBVA, Drummond, and ProAssurance. In his current role, he's helped establish a formal identity management program for the organization and collaborates closely with one of EBSCO's largest subsidiaries, EBSCO Information Services, for authentication and authorization of users in their environment. Last and certainly not least, Mr. John Byrd is an emergency substitution today. We were sad to hear that a little bit of an emergency right now. There's a lot of chaos from the storms last night, creating power and connectivity issues. So Mr. Byrd was generous to jump in at the last minute with almost no warning to help round out the panel today. He was, until recently, also with BBVA, a lot of great experience in the bank, working together with Andrew. He's John Byrd's a cloud security professional with 3 years of in-depth security and governance experience at scale. Okay, so I'm going to disappear now. If we can go around the room, Andrew, we'll start with you, followed by Ivana, followed by Willie, followed by John. If you guys could give us just a quick introduction, tell us sort of where your organization is and what stage of the cloud journey, what sort of priorities and utilization you're currently at. I think a general awareness of your cloud posture will help contextualize a lot of the conversation and hopefully give our crowd some ideas of topics that they'd like to hear from you. Thank you all very much. I will disappear now.
Thanks, Jeremy. Glad to join today. So like Jeremy said, I'm with BBVA. I have a number of teams that are cloud specific, and as far as our usage, we use as a global bank. We have services with GCP, with Azure, and with AWS, as well as a number of SaaS products, as well as our own private cloud that our global group manages and we consume as each country. And so my team manages some of the security operations of that private cloud, as well as the governance and security and strategy around our use of public cloud in the US. Heavy users in AWS, very large scale usage there. Still kind of dipping our toe in the water with Azure and GCP.
Thank you, Andrew. So as mentioned previously by Jeremy, I'm currently SVP at Regions. I've been with Regions for 2 years. And for the past year, we started our journey to cloud, building the business case and building the proposal and structuring how would that bigger organization look in order to support successful cloud deployments. We are in early stages when it comes to managing IaaS services. We decided to go with Polycloud, AWS, and Azure. We have quite a few SaaS service providers, and we had them for a while at the bank, but building the Cloud Center of Excellence and focusing the team and specific group and aiming into direction of broader usage and adoption of cloud, we're making strides and moving forward rather quickly from this point on.
Great, thank you, Ivana. Willie?
Yeah, so I've been with EBSCO for closing in on 2 years at the end of November. The group that I work for is called Corp IT, and we actually support all of the business units that are owned by EBSCO. EBSCO is a privately held conglomerate. They have all kinds of businesses. There's not really a good rhyme or reason to how they've gotten into each of the businesses. Anything from worm farms to deer feeder stands to poultry cameras, outdoor cameras, insurance, real estate, hydraulics, electronic media with EIS. Just it's all over the place. So from our perspective, we provide services. If they have nothing, we provide all of it. If they have their own teams, they just provide information back to us. And from an AWS perspective, as a whole, we have one large subsidiary, EIS, up in Ipswich, Massachusetts, deeply integrated with AWS. They've been using it for a number of years, and their plans are to move everything away from any data centers to AWS exclusively. And we're helping them along the path to get there. Within Corp IT, we're still in the early infancy stages of getting AWS stood up for moving and shrinking our data centers over time. We do use Azure with some of our other businesses. For example, with Pradco Outdoor Brands, they do use that and use it for the multi outdoor cameras. So our focus when we start talking about AWS is really around EIS and what they're doing there. And our team supports anything that we can from that perspective, access to AWS, setting up rules to limit who has access to those systems, and helping with just mapping with giving access into our domains from public cloud.
Great, thanks. John?
Well, as of last Friday, I had just ended my employment with BBVA, working with Andrew very closely to implement a lot of the solutions that his team had worked to kind of identify and show maturity, improve upon. Also worked within the cloud security team to build out the event management solution, account origination. If it's security stack related, I've touched it at some point. As of today, it's my third day at a new company, and I don't know that I'm necessarily ready to talk about them yet because I'm not sure myself. So.
Right. Well, we're happy to have you on such short notice. So thanks.
I appreciate the opportunity.
All right. So kind of piggybacking off those introductions, Ivana, Regions very early into an extremely ambitious and an exciting initiative with their cloud adoption. And you mentioned, what it takes to really position an organization successfully to build that. One of the things that we hear a lot in these conversations are not just the seasoned engineers that join us, but business leaders and people in organizations that would really like to make this case and understand the business case to begin a similar AWS or Azure or GCP cloud journey. And there's a lot to bite off there. It's a very massive effort and a lot of challenges in determining where to start and how to approach that. I would love to hear your thoughts on how you begin that journey and really tackle this from the business case and the preparation standpoint.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, Jeremy. Of course, we're living in pretty much digital transformation era this year, at least, and especially with everything that COVID had to do to expedite some of that process and push us forward, work to advantage in regards to technology and evolution of that technology. So understanding that from the business perspective, right, the business agility demands information technology to provide services that are closer to the customer and allow for entry into new opportunities much faster than ever before. And technology has to provide the real-time business relevant insight and services. The need to determine that proper workload placement is very, very critical. So what you have heard from at least the most of us on the call from the panelists is that each one of us has that security background. So I think when it comes to cloud journey and just thinking, where do you begin? When it comes to financial institutions, there's a lot of hesitation. There are a lot of unknowns. And usually everybody sees security as that first showstopper and roadblock to move to cloud. When you bring into organization security professionals that actually have the prior experience, that actually dip their foot into the cloud world and understand all the interoperability of the cloud, as well as benefits that come from cloud when it comes to security, and you gain that comfort, the security, I think, has that biggest push and ability to push and help transform organization and move it towards cloud. So I think building that partnership with security team, making sure that a security group is well versed with what cloud has to offer, which is very hard. I must admit, especially coming to the companies that are very much traditional, that are used to being able to touch that infrastructure, walk down to the data center and make sure the firewall is still there, or IDS or IPS appliance. It's very hard to change that mindset that all of a sudden you do not have that control, the control of filling that hardware infrastructure and being able to touch it and keep it on top of your fingers, right? So I think the security plays a very, very important role. And I remember when I first joined Regions myself 2 years ago, when I even mentioned Office 365 as a SaaS, everybody said, no, we're never going to do that, put email in cloud. We made huge progress, right? And we have quite a few different things already deployed in IIS just as a test scenario, because security build that focus group that it's able to actually drive that transformation and secure it in a very proper way. Of course, security sees cloud as an opportunity to kind of correct all the sins from the past that we have done in our traditional data center space or have on our traditional networks. So we understand the things that didn't work. And so we're leveraging those to start with a clean green slate and actually are able to provide even more secure environment for our institutions or organizations, right? While also enabling business to do things faster, making our development community more eager to use these environments with a lot more hardcore placement of agents while still keeping it secure. And also education. Education is key in continuing that message across the organization of how cloud works, what does work, what doesn't, that we have to change the mindset and transform way of thinking on what it takes to manage cloud. As a lot of traditional data center and traditional teams, they're focused on perimeter security. All we talk about is we have very hardened network, we have all these firewalls, we have all these assets that are on perimeter, and on the inside, right, not as focused as we should have been perhaps. When it comes to cloud, the whole perspective of how we manage security is different. So education, enabling teams to be trained, providing them appropriate training, very, very important for the growth of organization and buying into cloud. And of course, making sure that we keep our traditional team members that are supporting operational functions, very important part of that transformation for the future. So do not, even though I lead the Cloud Center of Excellence team, and we build that Cloud Center of Excellence team with multitude of positions that takes to run the cloud successfully, I think making sure that the rest of the organization gets the visibility, understands it, gets the appropriate input, and that mutual sharing of information will help things move forward much faster.
Terrific. Thank you very much for that insight. I want to follow up on a couple of things you touched on in there, and I'm actually going to pivot to Andrew for a second. So BBVA has gone through a very aggressive adoption of cloud, not just from AWS and infrastructure standpoint, but even predating that, there was a pretty stark pivot a number of years ago to you, Ivana, you touched on just sort of the roadblocks from a security mindset of adopting something like Office 365. BBVA went through a very similar transition with adopting Google Apps, G Suite, a number of years ago. Andrew, I'd love to hear from your perspective about the challenges. Ivana mentioned the challenges of education and of building up a competency and strong resources in security amidst a transition like this, and just also you being able to enable a business focus and not getting caught in kind of maybe some of the traps and misconceptions of a traditional security mindset. Andrew, if you could kind of speak to us about what you went through in BBVA's transitions from a talent and education standpoint and culturally of addressing that the traditional mindsets and enabling business.
Yeah, so just one little clarification there. I actually wasn't with BBVA when they transitioned to Google, and so I can't exactly speak to that, but I have definitely been a key part of the upward push into AWS, kind of starting from not a lot of governance and process around it to very structured process and thought behind how and what we do. I think a couple of things that are important to me. One is you've got to have top level buy-in and ownership of the cloud adoption. I think we're seeing a trend with a lot of banks wanting to do this, especially I was part of a panel last year with the Federal Reserve Bank, because they are now understanding cloud and pushing more knowledge and expectations around how the cloud is used. And so having them behind this is helpful, as well as having executives understand exactly what we're doing. I think one of the challenges that a lot of people will see, especially organizations that have, I'll call it a legacy infrastructure. I don't really like that term, because there's absolutely a valid use case for on-premise technology. And just because it's on-prem doesn't mean it's old, doesn't mean it's useless, doesn't mean it's antiquated or outdated. There's absolutely those things, but the reality is there's also those things in the cloud as well. I can put something that's old and antiquated in the cloud just as easily. I think one of the big things that, I'll say two things that I think we have to do. One is it's a mindset shift. So if we have folks that are used to a lot of their risk mitigation coming from slow process, and what I mean by that is how many people recognize that it takes a lot of time and a lot of approvals to make a change happen, right? I need to add a rule to a firewall. I need to update an IPS sensor. There's a lot of approvals that have to happen, specific change windows and whatnot. Well, a lot of that becomes a lot easier in the cloud and a lot faster. And so slow process is no longer able to be a risk mitigator. And so if we don't take a step back and think about the governance and controls that we're going to put in place for the cloud service providers, which are going to be very different, even though they're the same concepts as they are on-prem, we're going to see a lot of risk introduced with changes that we don't expect or that we don't want. And essentially, as you move to the cloud, you'll start building a legacy environment in the cloud. I think the other big piece is education and training, because if we take people who have had no experience in a cloud environment with a cloud service provider, then their default is going to be to bring the on-prem expectations to the cloud. Now, a lot of the technology and understanding is the same as we move between the two, but the implementation and the expectations are different. And so what we don't want to do is try and rebuild what we have already in the cloud. And if we don't bring in talent and whether it's training, whether it's consultants, whether it's key personnel that have done this before, we risk doing that. And why that's a problem is we don't want to put in all of these check boxes, if you will. I'm using check boxes from a compliance standpoint in the cloud, so that it's really hard to work. Because what's going to happen is either no one's going to use it, or they're going to find ways around it. And so I think it's really important for the governance and the security stakeholders to understand that, and create a term that you'll hear in the cloud is guardrails. Essentially, create a box for them to work freely inside of. If we don't do that, and we don't go with a mindset of enabling the business, adoption is going to wane, and the overall adoption of the cloud itself is going to fail. So I think that's a big piece of it.
Great. And we've got our first question from the crowd, Jared Hunter. And Andrew, he asked this one directed at you. I'd also like to hear from Willie on this. I think he's got some relevant experience here too. So if the two of you guys want to jump in. What's the primary driver behind the decision to implement the other two cloud providers into your infrastructure? Any plans to integrate environments among the three providers? If so, what are some of the tools and applications that make this process more seamless? And again, that was a question from Jared Hunter. So Andrew and Willie, please.
I'll take a quick piece of it, and then Willie, you can take some. I think the key here is what we decide to use AWS versus Azure versus GCP for is probably going to be different what the next bank or the next organization is going to use. I think the key there is spending the time with executives and key engineers and understand what that is, and then define how you're going to use each of those. As far as integrating them, I think that's kind of an ambiguous question. And what I mean by that is I see the point and I see the idea, but if you clearly define why you're using them, I think you'll find a lot of times there's not a need to make them work seamlessly between each other. I think where you want those integrations is with your I'm going to say tools. I don't mean specific tools and technology, but like the things that you're going to use for governance, for asset management, for reporting. You're going to want those to support all the different cloud service providers. But I don't think it's necessary to plan on, except in specific use cases, integrating them between each other.
Yeah, and I would kind of say the same thing. I mean, from an EBSCO perspective, the business units have some flexibility to work the way they want to. So, in one situation, Pradco's very big into Microsoft. We have a lot of Microsoft tools that we use, operating systems, and that's their primary method of operation. So, and when you start trying to expand beyond that, typical things that people have done going back to, the first cloud integrations, email integrations, a lot of people went to Microsoft. Google is used as well, and BBVA used it, but a lot of people use Microsoft. So if you're successful with that, your company's happy with it, you may go down that route where you want to continue just using the same vendor and not spread yourself out. So I think that was part of the reason those decisions were made before I got there, but that's from what I've heard in discussions, that's why they chose that route. Also with the tools that they're using, some of the vendors are using, we're kind of pointing them in that direction. So we don't develop everything ourselves. Usually we're using bits and pieces of components to make everything work, and so that can play a part in. EIS chose AWS, and when they chose, they went hard with it. Same thing with going to an agile development process. They went hard with it, and they really spend time as a business unit. They spend time with education. Their process, if you ever were to look up Doug Jenkins, he's our CIO for EIS. You can find him on YouTube, and there's a video of him talking about their practices, and they like to spend about 20% of their time focused on education. So, Ivana said something earlier that really caught my attention, which was education is important, not just for the development teams, but really for the support personnel. She also mentioned something about control too. It goes back to what are you picking? You want to have some control over what you're working in, and so people tend to go towards familiar products or familiar vendors. That plays a part in that cloud provider decision. the integration of the tools on the back end for the applications to work, whether they're on AWS or they're Azure or wherever they are. You can get those to work, the integration tools. And Jared, I would think of it more from a security perspective is what are you using to monitor those applications and those environments? And if you're using native tools for it, how does that help you when you start trying to tie those into a backend application? As long as they're, the output is still the same, you can pull it into your systems. It may not be that big of a deal. In some cases with smaller companies, they don't have the overhead and the manpower to actually be able to do any of that. So they're going to keep it as simple as they can.
Willie, I would add one thing to what you said, that I think there's one caveat from my opinion earlier, is that if you're using CI/CD pipelines and infrastructure as code, which you should be in most cases when you're planning on moving into a cloud service provider, you should consider using tools that are agnostic to the cloud service provider. So if you plan on going all in with AWS and you're probably not going to touch Azure or GCP much, then it's probably okay to look at things like code deploy. But if you're planning on spending just as much effort in Azure and GCP or similar things, you're probably going to want to look at things like Jenkins and Terraform as opposed to using those native tools. Otherwise, you're going to have 3 distinct ways you're deploying code.
Thanks, Andrew. So we've got another audience question. David asks, what software for on-premise private cloud systems are you using? VMware, Hyper-V, others? Do all the cloud providers work the same with these components and moving to a hybrid configuration? And David, let me remind you, please reach out to Justin with your email. We'd love to throw an Uber Eats gift card your way. Thank you for the question. John, you got any thoughts to tee off on this one? And of course, anybody else in the group, feel free to dive in. I know BBVA's done a little bit with this. Not sure if that was specifically your area, but anyone feel free to jump in.
I think Andrew can probably add some more context to it, but one of the things I can speak to just from the perspective of working with these providers, or specifically with VMware and AWS specifically have a partnership. So one of the things you may run into is seeing some of these third-party solutions. You may end up leaning towards one or the other simply because the integration with the cloud provider that you're using is going to be there where it's not going to be with others. Not saying that should necessarily drive your decision, because usually you're going to be coming from a legacy environment in that case. But do look at where you can integrate with the native solutions of the platform with those third-party tools.
Yeah, just to add on to that, my comment just a minute ago about things like Terraform, because it's agnostic, they actually have libraries for both VMware and AWS and other cloud service providers. So you can perform similar infrastructure as code changes, both on-prem and with AWS. Also, there's things like VMC with AWS, which we're looking at. We're not actively using it at the moment, but we're considering it. That can natively let you deploy VMware into AWS. As far as our private cloud, obviously we have VMware and others, but our global private cloud is managed in OpenShift, and our interface into that is customized tools. So it's it's one of those cases where we created something just for that, and then we have these other things that we're managing our public cloud with. And so there's definitely impacts to support and operations in that, but it's something that we deal with. But I would just say that I think that all goes back to that understanding from the top down, what's your overall strategy in public, private, hybrid cloud. What are you planning on using? Why are you using it? What's your roadmap? And understanding how all those technology decisions impact that. Because if you're just looking at it in a microcosm and missing the forest for the trees, then what you're going to run into is you're going to have 5 different providers, whether it's local or public, with legacy environments that you've then got to migrate into some new thing. Whereas if you can take a step back and think about that roadmap, it'll save you a lot of time down the road.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So we've got another great question from Shannon Taylor. And Shannon, please reach out to Justin for your gift card. How do you stay vigilant on vulnerability management, keeping an eye on patches, updates, user provisioning, etc., across clouds and applications? Nobody wants to be the next Equifax. Thanks. So Ivana and John, would y'all love to steer this one to y'all to kick off? And of course, Andrew, I think it looks like you want to add to this too, so please feel free to join in. I'm sure this is a topic forefront of everybody's mind.
Ivana, I'll let you go
Absolutely.
first.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Great question. So I'm very passionate when it comes to vulnerability management to begin with, and patching processes. One of the key things, I'm going to start with a bigger picture and then go back to your answer, right? When it comes to just building that cloud-centric culture within the organization, and I mentioned the role of security. Another important piece is kind of creating that security blueprint. And what I mean by that is creating the cloud security governance body. So understanding what are those controls that we have to make sure are in cloud, how are they managed in cloud versus on-prem, what technologies will we use to address those, and how the technologies that we will use to address those in cloud differ than what we do today on-prem. There's a lot of misconception, especially, again, I don't like using the term the traditional or infrastructure current teams, but there is a misconception that we're going to do the manual provisioning like we do today. We're going to do the manual hardening, the manual patching, etc., which is opposite of how cloud works. And that's one of the key things when it comes to cloud is we move away from traditional way and mindset of thinking of securing the perimeter to the key role in cloud is access management. So managing your access, controlling your access, and putting very, very strong structure against how that access is provisioned, maintained, and monitor, that's a key kind of security posture when it comes to just deploying something in IIS. So how we define it, how we build it, what tools and technologies do you use to do that, it's one of the key pieces. When it comes to vulnerability management, so the traditional network vulnerability scanning, whether that's Qualys, Tenable, Rapid7 that we use for the on-prem infrastructure, is also available in cloud. But how do we approach the vulnerabilities? It's very different. As the whole premise of cloud is not as having a static IP, scanning the same IP over and over on a monthly basis, weekly basis, remediating the vulnerabilities, right? Systems, a lot of infrastructure that's in cloud, it's very dynamic. It changes completely. Things are stood up, things are stood down. So there are different tools and technologies that are leveraged for kind of making sure that the vulnerabilities are captured. That stays in the same realm of the same vendors, but the remediation of these vulnerabilities and what's critical prior to deployment changes significantly from what's on-prem. Having the solid vulnerability management standard and the remediation timeframes that are specific to a data center as well as the cloud infrastructure, it's very, very important. And there are multitudes of tools there that are used for that. In addition to patching, all of that, there's no more pretty much the manual cycle of we are doing Microsoft patches on a monthly basis, Unix on 6 months, 8 months, whatever. A lot of these things are very much automated. They're push of the button and they happen behind the scenes where we can prevent millions of vulnerabilities and our infrastructure of exceptions where we build automation and we prevent insecure images to be deployed, to be pushed out, etc. So a lot more programmatic, a lot more automated, and a lot more streamlined than what we have today. I'll turn it over to you, John, and or Andrew.
I think I'm going to take what Ivana said and just run with it. One, I can't get behind identity and access management being the foundation for where you start. You don't have problems if people who shouldn't be making changes can't make the changes. So just cut it off at the base. But kind of adding on to that, another thing that Ivana said earlier was talking about bringing in the traditional or the legacy, the old school, the on-prem, however you want to word it, the operations folks, and making sure that they're included in the transition to cloud. Make sure that they're doing infrastructure as code. Make sure that they're understanding how they're going to administer things at scale in the new cloud environment. And then what that naturally leads to is the other thing that Ivana said, which is the automation. There's no reason that you should not be looking at an automation process in some form or fashion in every approach that you take with cloud security. The biggest thing from my perspective of the biggest difference between on-prem and cloud security, I always get a little agitated when people say, well, we're doing it this way on-prem, we should at least do it this way in the cloud. You should be doing it beyond that. The cloud offers so many more feature sets and functionality that you can actually improve upon and build on, that you should not necessarily be thinking about it. How do we bring the cloud up to where we are on-prem? It should be, where do we need to be in the cloud and how do you get there?
So, John, that's a perfect point. I was going to add 2 or 3 sentences to that. I think the key here to that question is, if you aren't doing it well on-prem, and I think that's probably the case in a lot of areas for people, it's not going to be any better in the cloud. The cloud doesn't just fix that; it's going to make it. It's not going to change. And similar to Ivana, I could talk for hours on vulnerability management and whatnot, but I think the 2 things there is, vulnerability management is not equal to patch management. You got to patch your stuff. There's no way around that. That should be done no matter what. As far as vulnerability management, things get a little more complicated in the cloud because a lot of vulnerability programs are based on inherent risk. And inherent risk is in reality useless in a lot of ways because it's not the real risk of what you're looking at. The residual risk in the cloud becomes a lot more complicated to understand. You've got a lot more steps that you've got to get through to find out what the actual risk is. And so vulnerability management is definitely something that should be considered, and how it's going to be approached in the cloud. But the reality is, if you're not doing it well already, I'm not sure the cloud's going to fix that.
Willie, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, your process for patching, they've touched on most of those things. You know, one of the things we try to do, and it'll vary, but it's very easy for you with automation to rebuild everything instead of just patching. So we have a process where we're rebuilding not just the application, but all aspects of it when we put new releases out. So the idea of, like, you know, when do I need to patch this? Well, I need to patch kind of the golden image, the core images that we're using, and it makes it a little bit easier than it does when you start having, you know, multiple images that are not kept up to date. But I think at the end of this, and everybody's kind of talked about this. Think about it. It's a change in philosophy. It's not like just taking what you have and moving it to the cloud. And there's different reasons people go to the cloud, whether they think it's a cost savings, whether it's the development team thinking, I'm tired of waiting on people, I'm going to start doing this on my own in their dark little corner, or whatever it is. But I've just recently gone through building a new house, and if you know what you want up front, and you know what your plans are up front, and you incorporate them into the initial cost of the house, then it costs you a fixed amount and you're good with it. But as soon as you start sign that contract and you're like, you know what, I don't think I like I had it out there. I want to change some things around now. And you start customizing or making changes on the fly, it'll start catching up with you real fast. Not only because it's a change in the scope, but also because the builders are used to doing it a certain way. And when you start trying to change that, they don't like it and they want to charge you for it. So you got to think about your mindset of your own teams that have built whatever, I'll call it traditional, but that traditional environment was set up and they've used a process that they've known for years to set it up and put in place, and it's not exactly the same. And so going back to what Ivana said earlier, and I touched on it with education, you've got to educate not just the development people. It's all across the board. It's security, it's the infrastructure, it is the firewall teams, it's the networking teams understanding what needs to be open, the database teams, all of these pieces. While it is easier, and hopefully what you do is you build some integration and automation that can help address this. If you don't understand what you're doing with it, you could come out with a mess. So it's, most organizations, if it comes from the top down, it helps drive it. Regions, I was at Regions years ago, there was nothing in the cloud. From what I'm hearing from Ivana, they're making a very logical, methodical approach. Let's make sure we understand what the framework's going to be. Let's get our contracts in place before we sign off and start doing it. And if you do that, I think you'll come out with a good result. I kind of think of it with the waterfall mentality. You want to know what you're getting there, but then you've got the other side of it, where you want to have people that are just in sprints and iterations in the agile process, and they want to keep just give me enough and let's keep going. And you've got to find a balance between those two, or you'll run off into a ditch in no time. I mean, you watch articles about data being leaked, and how many times over the last 3 years have you found somebody lost data not because of a security hack, but because somebody forgot to lock down a bucket, an S3 bucket or whatever it is that they didn't lock down correctly. They opened up something to the internet and had no idea that everybody could get to it. Those are the things that, scare the hell out of everybody when you start thinking about taking what I'm used to, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. These are the things I always do over and over again. And now I've got to change it over here and I don't understand it yet. So, it's education. I would say, John and I have worked together for a long time. 4 years ago, what he knew about AWS and what he knows now is light years different. And so he sees it. He's a proponent of it. I would lean on him in no time to ask a question because he's bought into it. But if you don't have somebody getting your teams to buy into this, you're just going to have a lot of frustration, and you may end up having security holes, and you may have slowdowns. There's got to be a plan, and there's got to be some consistency with that.
Great, thanks, Willie. So I want to pivot for a second to, let's talk about, this is really relevant for how you build your strategy around implementing your security and governance practices around AWS in general. Andrew, if you could talk a little bit high level on just conceptually, how do you approach platform as a service adoption, and more specifically, tell us a little bit about your experience and how you position the organization in AWS's shared responsibility model and approaching that.
Sure. So I think the first piece there is anyone looking to move to the cloud needs to understand what the shared responsibility model is. I have some good visuals. AWS has a lot of good visuals. I don't have them available to show on this. But essentially what it says is that if you have software as a service, you're responsible for a lot less of the back end. If you have platform as a service, you're responsible for a little more than SaaS. And if you have infrastructure as a service, you're responsible for everything other than what the cloud service provider gives you, basically everything other than the physical hardware. So I think understanding that and when and where it's okay to use is important. Really not okay to use, but when and where your organization is willing to use it. And so I think a lot of that means that organizations need to actually understand what threat modeling is, what the threat model of each of those is, and understand their risk appetite, because each comes with a level of risk. And so I think you mentioned platform as a service specifically because it's kind of in the middle, right? Software as a service is easy to think of as a black box. Like I bought this physical device and I put it in, and that's that's my thing. That's kind of what people think of software as a service. But the reality is we're trusting someone else to do everything that we're doing in cloud with their cloud, whether it's Azure, AWS, or Rackspace, whatever it may be, we're trusting them to do all that. And so there's an inherent level of risk in that. In platform as a service, there's still some pieces there. With AWS specifically, there's a number of examples. I think Fargate or Elastic Beanstalk are a couple of technology examples. The reality is you are making a decision to trade off operational responsibility for risk acceptance, whether it's encryption or shared hardware, whatever that may be. You're deciding you're going to accept that risk so that you don't have to have the same operational responsibilities. I think a lot of times what people forget about the shared responsibility model is that it's not also including a shared accountability model. There is no shared accountability model. All the accountability lives with you. So how you decide where you're going to be responsible needs to reflect your level of risk acceptance and ultimately what you're going to be accountable for when something happens.
Thanks, Andrew. Ivana, love to go back to something you touched on at the beginning, and that's something I think everybody, I'm sure all of the panelists will have something to add and would really love to hear from everybody, is the types of transformations that we're really launched by what we've experienced in 2020 with COVID. Yeah, I think we've talked a lot about, we've heard from all of you today a lot about strategy and best practice. Let's, really pivot to what happens when all the best plans go out the window with a year like we've had. And, love to hear about your experiences of how you've pivoted and how you've been able to mitigate a transformative event like this.
Absolutely. Thank you. Great question. Well, what happened from the transformation perspective, right? We have seen a lot of changes across the industry overall, no matter what industry you belong to. But the need for speed, the need for quick reaction, and need to be able to continuously provide support to our consumers, customers without any interruption, regardless of what is happening, has driven a lot more open-mindedness to adopting and accepting solutions, additional solutions such as SaaS, being more creative, and seeing the opportunity that the cloud is the path of the future. Whether we want to accept it, whether we want to live in misconception that we can do it better, faster, and or cheaper on-prem, it is not correct. We really have to become open-minded, and that kind of served us from just the region's perspective, opened our eyes on the things that we had to adjust very quickly on when it comes to supporting our customers, and the amount of work that it took to make our traditional infrastructure and traditional data center fit into that model when we could have done that with our cloud service provider in half of the time that it took us to do it on-prem, I think has enabled us to use the momentum and push cloud strategy forward much faster.
And I think this kind of goes back to what, Jared asked a question about upgrades. More, I don't know if it was more towards the applications in the cloud, but I kind of like what Ivana was talking about. If you can get the applications that your team supports into the cloud and not have to worry about the infrastructure updates on the back end, it frees you up to actually use the tool. We still use on-prem tools here at EBSCO, but I will tell you the updates that Okta makes, for example, that's one of the companies we use, it just happens for us. And so it's a matter of going and seeing what new features are out there and taking advantage of it instead of trying to figure out, am I gonna have to order hardware for this? Who do I need to schedule to get that database updated? Is it gonna have to be clustered? How am I gonna back this stuff up? There's so much back end when you buy a product that your team supports, you don't realize how much time you waste on that. And so there's definitely advantages to having applications, not just customer facing, but your own tools that your teams are using in the cloud and taking that layer of complexity of maintaining it out of their hands. I love that. We try to do that. We have a very small team here in terms of the identity and access management team. So we have to be focused as much as we can on features and functionality as opposed to maintaining and upgrading.
Anybody else want to, Andrew or John, want to add on with some of your experiences, COVID particularly, but just really surprise events and how you adapt?
I think we actually spoke to this on a previous AWS meetup, but the functionality of workspaces within AWS and having, again, the automation around provisioning of workspaces, it really has allowed the ability for remote work to keep going. Additional tool in the tool belt. It's not a silver bullet, but it's just another feature set that we have to rely on.
Love that you referenced back to what was our very first session when we pivoted. What we began as an in-person meetup in Birmingham.
Be sure to check that out on YouTube.
Yeah, all the plugs, thanks, John. But again, it was a pivot into a virtual format for this that ultimately ended up becoming a strength. Andrew, anything you want to add?
I think most of what I would add has been touched on. I think I've been responding to some of the questions in the Q&A, and I think something that I said there really is part of this is let your strategy dictate the technology and not the other way around. I think when you let technology dictate your strategy, that's when you find yourselves backed into a corner in a lot of these places. When you let the strategy dictate the technology, the options are endless, and there's a lot of value in whichever way you go.
And be ready to justify yourself when audit comes knocking and asking you to explain how this is as secure. They will.
Yep.
All right, well, we are getting close to the hour. There is we've got an outstanding question from Jalissa Hunter pertaining to incorporating containers. What I'd like to do is I want to go ahead and begin wrapping up the conversation. So if there's if any of the panelists are available to address Jalissa's question via chat while I run through a couple of things, that would be fantastic. But
yep, I was actually in the middle of typing an answer to that. So
okay, outstanding. So I want to extend a tremendous thank you to our panelists today, Ivana, Andrew, Willie, and John, for the hero last minute join. This was a fantastic conversation. You get into the momentum of this and almost wish it could go on and on, but we recognize everybody has got to get back to busy days, and love that we were able to slide this into everybody's lunch today. So thank you all very much for your time, the generosity of your insights to this conversation and for the community. And again, Andrew, thanks for the original idea that kicked us off with this. Couple of closing announcements. Again, we're here every month, the last Thursday of every month, with the Birmingham AWS meetup. We hope many of you who joined for the first time today will come back and see us on occasion as there are topics that hit your interest. We're going to post a survey into the chat and also email it out afterwards. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feedback on that. Next month is hands-on lab with building and deploying .NET in AWS. Hope you'll join us for that. And then the December 10th holiday event in conjunction with Birmingham.NET and Base. As always, the YouTube recording of this will be posted in a couple of days. We're always looking for topic submissions at bhmaws@gmail.com. And of course, those stickers are always out there. If anybody wants one, send us your address. Thank you, everyone, for your time and attention today. And we hope everyone is doing well with the fallout from the storms and power and disruption, and that everything gets nice and you all head into a great weekend. Appreciate it. Hope to see you back next month. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.